The wreckage of Varnuk ships floated silently in Earth's orbit, broken and burning. The once mighty fleet had expected to overwhelm this primitive world in a matter of hours. Instead, they had suffered a defeat so sudden, so devastating, that even the survivors could barely comprehend what had happened. Admiral Torvik stood frozen on the bridge of his flagship, his claws gripping the control panel. His eyes darted across the battlefield, searching for an explanation. This was supposed to be easy. This was supposed to be a lesson to the galaxy that the Varnuk Empire was unstoppable. Instead, his fleet was in shambles. "Report," he barked, his voice betraying the first signs of fear. "Sir, our forward assault groups are gone. Half of the fleet has been destroyed or disabled. The humans, they were waiting for us." Torvik's mind raced. This was not how wars were fought. Primitive species cowered. They surrendered. They begged for mercy. But Earth had done none of these things. It had not pleaded. It had not asked for negotiations. It had simply retaliated, without hesitation, without mercy. "Human fleet is repositioning," another officer shouted. "They are preparing for a second strike." Torvik gritted his teeth. No, he would not allow this. The Varnuk Empire did not retreat. "Order all remaining ships to regroup. Target their command ships and—" The alarms on the bridge wailed. "Admiral." The officer's voice was laced with terror. "A new energy signature detected. Something is launching from Earth." Torvik turned toward the main view screen. A single ship had broken through the atmosphere, rising from the planet below. It was sleek, dark, and unlike anything they had seen before. It moved with terrifying speed, cutting through the battlefield like a predator among prey. The bridge fell silent as they watched it weave through the debris, heading straight for them. "It's just one ship," an officer whispered. Torvik felt a chill run through him. A lone warship. No fleet to back it up. No reinforcements. The arrogance or the confidence? "Scan it," he ordered. A few moments passed. Then came the answer. "Sir, the readings don't make sense. Its mass is too dense for a ship of that size. Its energy output is off the charts. I think that thing is a battleship, but it's moving like a fighter." Torvik narrowed his eyes. This was impossible. No empire in the galaxy had technology that advanced. Before he could process this, the ship moved. It accelerated so fast that the sensors struggled to keep up. One moment, it was distant. The next, it was in firing range. Then it opened fire. The Varnuk fleet had been through wars. They had fought powerful enemies. But nothing had ever prepared them for this. The human warship didn't fire missiles or plasma cannons. It used something far more terrifying. Its first volley shredded through a Varnuk destroyer like paper. The second cracked the shields of a battlecruiser that should have been able to withstand a planetary bombardment. The ship's weapons were too precise, too efficient. It wasn't just firing randomly. It was dissecting the fleet. "That's not a warship," an officer whispered. "That's a predator." Torvik watched in horror as the lone ship disabled 3 of his remaining capital ships in under a minute. No wasted shots. No hesitation. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The humans had been hiding. For years, they had let the galaxy believe they were weak, that they were just another species struggling to survive. But that had been a lie. They had technology beyond anything the Varnuk could have imagined. They had weapons designed for total warfare. And worst of all, they had no fear. The bridge was deathly silent as the ship finally stopped, hovering just outside their main defense line. Then, a transmission came through. It was a human voice, calm, emotionless. "Leave now, or be erased." Torvik's breath caught in his throat. He had come expecting to conquer a helpless world. Instead, he had awakened a monster. Silence filled the Varnuk fleet. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The voice that had echoed across their communications channels was calm, almost indifferent. But beneath that calmness was something far worse than rage. It was certainty. It was the voice of a species that knew it had already won. Admiral Torvik stood frozen on the bridge of his flagship, his claws digging into the metal railing as he stared at the lone human warship floating in the void. It was small compared to the massive vessels of the Varnak Empire, barely the size of a standard cruiser. And yet, it had torn through his fleet with such terrifying precision that it almost seemed unreal. "Leave now, or be erased." The words repeated in his mind over and over again. This could not be happening. The humans were supposed to be weak. Their technology was supposed to be outdated, inferior. That was what their spies had reported. That was what their analysts had calculated. But reality was something else entirely. "Admiral," one of his officers whispered, his voice barely steady. "What are your orders?" Orders? What orders could he possibly give? Half his fleet was already destroyed or disabled. The humans had not even sent a fleet of their own. Just a single ship that had turned his invasion force into a massacre. We can't run," another officer said hesitantly. "The Emperor gave direct orders to conquer Earth. If we retreat, if we stay, we die." Torvik snapped, his voice sharp with anger and fear. "You saw what that thing did to our ships. That is no ordinary vessel." The officer hesitated, but Torvik could see the truth in his eyes. They all knew it. The Varnak were powerful, but they had never faced an enemy like this before. An enemy that did not hesitate. An enemy that did not fight like the rest of the galaxy. "Admiral," another officer shouted suddenly, "the human ship is moving." Torvik turned back to the view screen, and his blood ran cold. The lone warship, which had been hovering in place, had suddenly accelerated. Not just moving, but charging. Brace for impact. The Varnak fleet scrambled to react. Weapons locked on. Energy shields activated. The flagship's main cannons fired, unleashing beams of raw plasma powerful enough to crack open an asteroid. The human ship dodged. It didn't simply evade. It moved like nothing Torvik had ever seen before. It twisted through space with impossible agility, as if the laws of physics meant nothing to it. Every shot fired at it missed. It danced through the storm of plasma and missiles, closing the distance with terrifying speed. And then it struck. Torvik barely had time to react before the first explosion rocked the fleet. The human ship didn't just fire weapons. It tore through their defenses with calculated brutality. Its railguns, firing rounds at near-light speed, punched through the hulls of Varnak battleships like they were made of glass. One by one, ships exploded, their crews screaming as they were engulfed in fire and debris. The Varnak fleet was supposed to be invincible, and yet they were being slaughtered. "Impossible," Torvik whispered. "This is impossible." It wasn't just the ship. It was the way the humans were fighting. Every other species in the galaxy fought with strategy, with careful positioning, with predictable patterns. The humans fought with something else entirely. Instinct. The lone warship did not hesitate. It did not waste time with unnecessary maneuvers. It attacked like a predator going for the kill. It struck the weakest points in the Varnak formations, tearing through the fleet's command structure, cutting off their lines of communication. "Sir," an officer shouted, "the flagship's shields are failing." Torvik turned, his heart pounding. On the view screen, he could see the human ship closing in. "Target it," he roared. "All remaining ships, fire everything we have." The fleet obeyed. Plasma cannons, missile salvos, energy lances. Every weapon in their arsenal was unleashed upon the lone ship. And yet, it still did not stop. The ship twisted through the chaos, avoiding the brunt of the attack. The few shots that did land barely scratched its armor. It was like fighting a ghost, an enemy that refused to die. Then the final blow came. The human ship fired a single shot, a single precise shot that struck the heart of the Varnak flagship. Torvik had only a second to register what had happened before the explosion consumed the bridge. The last thing he heard was the sound of alarms, the screams of his crew. and the cold, unshaken voice of the humans. Leave now, or be erased. The bridge of the Varnock command ship was burning. Emergency alarms howled through the wreckage, sparks raining from shattered control panels. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating. Admiral Torvik struggled to stand, gripping the edge of a broken console. His entire body ached, his vision blurry from the shock of the explosion. The flagship was crippled. A direct hit from the human warship had torn through its central power core, and the once mighty vessel was now little more than a drifting wreck in the void. Torvik's officers were dead. The command crew, veterans of countless battles, had been wiped out in seconds. He was alone, standing in the ruins of what had been the most powerful warship in the fleet, and the lone human warship was still there. It hovered just beyond the debris field, motionless, watching. It had not moved in the past several minutes. It had not followed up its attack. It simply waited. Torvik could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him. The humans were not celebrating. They were not gloating over their victory. They were waiting for him to decide. Surrender or die. The rest of the Varnock fleet was in chaos. What remained of his warships was either fleeing or desperately trying to regroup. Entire divisions had been wiped out in the first few minutes of the battle. The humans had fought like no enemy before them, relentless, precise, merciless. Torvik had seen planetary invasions. He had crushed weaker races beneath the might of the Varnock Empire. He had stood on conquered worlds and watched as species begged for their lives. But now, for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be prey. A flickering screen caught his attention. It was a direct link to the remains of his fleet. Static crackled for a moment before a familiar voice came through. "Admiral, this is Captain Vorkal of the Warbringer," a young officer said, his voice shaking. "Our forces are in full retreat. We can't hold our positions. That ship is too fast, too powerful. Our weapons barely scratch it." Torvik forced himself to stay calm. "How many ships do we have left?" "Less than a dozen, Admiral, and most of them are damaged." Torvik gritted his teeth. A dozen ships. Out of the hundreds he had brought to this system, the pride of the Varnock fleet had been reduced to scraps in a single battle. No, not a battle. A slaughter. His claws dug into the console. What about reinforcements? Captain Vorkal hesitated. "High Command. They aren't answering, sir. We've been cut off." Torvik's mind raced. Had the humans jammed their communications? No, this wasn't jamming. The signals weren't being blocked. They were being ignored. The Varnock Empire had abandoned them. Rage burned in his chest. The High Command had sent him on this mission with the full expectation of victory. They had dismissed the Council's warnings. They had believed humanity would fall like every other primitive species. And now, faced with defeat, they had decided to pretend this battle had never happened. Cowards. "Admiral, what do we do?" Torvik looked at the lone human warship on the screen. It had not moved, not attacked, not sent a single message since the battle ended. Waiting. "Sir," Vorkal's voice was barely a whisper. We can't fight that thing. If we stay here, we die." Torvik closed his eyes. He had never fled from a battle before. He had sworn an oath to the Varnock Empire, to fight until the last breath. But this wasn't a battle anymore. This was execution. All remaining ships. Torvik exhaled, forcing the words out. "Retreat. Now." There was silence on the other end. Then, quietly, Vorkal answered, "Understood, Admiral." One by one, the last of the Varnock warships turned and activated their FTL drives. They vanished into the void, fleeing in shame. Torvik turned back to the screen. He was the last one left. The lone human warship had not moved. The comms crackled to life again, the same voice as before. Cold, calm, unshaken. "You should have listened to the Council." Then, without another word, the human ship turned and disappeared back toward Earth. Torvik collapsed into his chair. He had survived. But it did not feel like survival. It felt like a warning. A warning that humanity had been underestimated for the last time. You said, the journey back to Varnock Prime was long and filled with silence. No one spoke. No one dared to. The few remaining warships, once the pride of the fleet, limped through space like broken beasts. Their hulls were scared, their engines barely holding together. Some ships flickered with failing power, their once mighty weapons now useless. Admiral Torvik sat alone in his private chamber, staring at the reports flashing across the console in front of him. The numbers were brutal. Over 90% of the invasion force had been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Varnock warriors gone. The flagship, the symbol of the Empire's strength, reduced to a drifting wreck. And all of it, every death, every loss, had been caused by a single human warship. Torvik clenched his fists. It made no sense. The humans were supposed to be weak, yet they had turned the Varnock Empire's greatest fleet into nothing more than space debris. And it wasn't just the technology, it was the way they fought. Ruthless, precise, cold. They had not hesitated, not once. The humans had given the Varnock a choice. Leave or be erased. Torvik's claws scraped against the metal of his desk. He had chosen to retreat, and now he would have to face the consequences. As the fleet finally emerged from FTL, the dark, towering spires of Varnock Prime came into view, the homeworld of the Empire, a place of power, of dominance, a world that had never known fear. Until now. The moment Torvik's ship entered orbit, the messages started. Demands from High Command, summons from the Emperor himself. The entire Empire had watched the battle. They had seen the disaster unfold in real time. They had seen their invincible fleet run. Torvik straightened his uniform and made his way to the transport shuttle. The city below was vast and magnificent, its skyline dominated by towering structures of metal and glass. The streets were filled with Varnock citizens, warriors and leaders, all waiting for answers. He could feel their eyes on him as he stepped off the shuttle. Whispers filled the air. Murmurs of defeat. The fleet was destroyed. A single ship did this. The humans. What are they? Torvik ignored them. His focus was on the massive doors ahead. Doors that led to the war hall, the seat of the Empire's military command. He stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of burning incense and polished steel. The War Council was waiting. The Emperor sat at the center, his piercing yellow eyes locked onto Torvik. The high generals flanked him, their faces grim. None of them spoke as he approached. Torvik knelt. Your Majesty. The Emperor's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the fury beneath it. Rise, Admiral. Torvik obeyed. The Emperor leaned forward, claws tapping against the armrest of his throne. Explain. Torvik took a deep breath. He knew there was no way to soften the truth. The humans were prepared. Their technology is beyond anything we have encountered. Their tactics are unlike any other species. We were outmatched. Silence. Then one of the high generals growled, slamming his fist onto the table. You mean to tell us that an entire fleet, our finest warships, our greatest warriors, were defeated by a single enemy vessel? Torvik's jaw tightened. Yes. The room erupted in angry voices. The high generals shouted, some calling for retaliation, others demanding an explanation. But the Emperor remained silent, his gaze never leaving Torvik. After a long moment, he raised his hand. The hall fell quiet. You say their tactics were different, the Emperor said slowly. Explain. Torvik hesitated, searching for the right words. They do not fight like we do. Other species in the galaxy follow patterns, defensive formations, predictable maneuvers. The humans, they fight with something else. Instinct, precision. They do not hesitate. They do not hold back. He paused. And they are not afraid. The room remained silent. Torvik continued, his voice steady. We have fought countless wars. We have crushed empires. But never, never have we faced an enemy like this. They did not beg. They did not negotiate. They gave us one warning. And when we refused, they acted. Swiftly, without mercy. The high generals exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted uncomfortably. The truth was settling in. The humans had not been lucky. This was not a fluke. This was a message. Torvik looked at the Emperor. If we attack them again, we will not survive. The words echoed through the war hall. For the first time in Varnak history, an admiral had spoken of an enemy not just as a threat, but as an equal. No, worse, as something greater. The Emperor stood. His golden armor gleamed under the dim lights, his presence commanding absolute silence. He walked forward slowly until he stood directly in front of Torvik. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he spoke. "Are you afraid of them, Admiral?" Torvik did not hesitate. Yes. The Emperor studied him. Then, to everyone's shock, he let out a slow, quiet breath. "So am I." A murmur spread through the high generals, some in disbelief, others in growing horror. The Varnak Empire had ruled the galaxy through power, through fear, but now, for the first time, they were the ones who were afraid. The Emperor turned, staring at the massive war map projected in the center of the hall. It showed the known galaxy, the countless systems under Varnak control. And among them, a single blue planet stood alone. Earth. The Emperor's claws curled into a fist. "Send an envoy," he ordered. "We will not make the same mistake twice." Torvik felt the tension in the airshift. This was not an act of surrender. It was not an admission of weakness. It was something far more dangerous. A new war had begun. Not one of weapons, but one of fear. The Varnak High Command had always been a place of power, a place where wars were decided, where fleets were commanded, where entire species were judged worthy to live or condemned to extinction. It was a fortress of absolute rule, built on the foundation of strength and dominance. But now, for the first time in its history, the air inside the chamber was heavy with something unfamiliar. Doubt. Admiral Torvik stood before the War Council once more, his back straight, his face expressionless. He had faced human fire. He had survived when thousands had not. He had returned from the greatest defeat the Empire had ever known. And yet he was not being celebrated. He was being judged. The war generals sat in a half-circle before him, their piercing yellow eyes filled with suspicion and anger. Some were gripping the edges of their seats, their claws twitching, barely restraining their fury. They had ruled with fear for centuries, and now that fear had been turned against them. The Emperor sat at the center of the room, his golden armor reflecting the dim light. His gaze was cold, unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of the Empire. "You were given the most powerful fleet in our history," he said, "and you lost it." Torvik did not flinch. "Yes, Your Majesty." To a single enemy warship. "Yes." A low growl rippled through the war generals. One of them, General Krovak, a warrior feared across the Empire, leaned forward, baring his fangs. "You disgrace the Varnak name. A single human ship could not have done this. You let fear cloud your mind. You failed." Torvik did not respond. He had expected this. The council needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to blame. And yet, they all knew the truth. The humans had done the impossible. The Emperor raised a hand, silencing the murmurs of anger. His gaze never left Torvik. "You told me that if we attack again, we will not survive. Explain." Torvik exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this moment. He had spent hours reliving the battle, analyzing every maneuver, every tactic the humans had used. The truth was undeniable. "They do not fight like us," he said. "They do not fight like any species we have conquered. They do not hesitate. They do not make mistakes." General Krovak scoffed. All species make mistakes, Admiral, even the mighty humans. Torvik met his glare. Then tell me, what mistake did they make in our battle? Krovak opened his mouth to respond. Then he stopped, because there was nothing to say. The humans had fought with terrifying precision. They had not wasted a single shot. Every maneuver had been calculated, every decision executed with ruthless efficiency. They had given no opportunity for weakness. It was as if they had already seen the battle before it began. They have studied us, Torvik continued. They know how we fight. They know our tactics, and they are prepared for them. His claws dug into his palm, but we did not study them. The silence in the room deepened. Torvik's voice lowered. They are not fighting to conquer. They are fighting to survive. And species that fight for survival are the most dangerous of all. The Emperor remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again. The humans spared you. It was not a question. It was a statement. A simple fact. Torvik's jaw tightened. He knew what the Emperor was truly asking. Why? The Varnak did not spare their enemies. Surrender meant nothing to them. A defeated enemy was a dead enemy. That was how the Empire had always ruled. And yet, the humans had held back. They were sending a message, Torvik said. They wanted us to understand what they are capable of. His voice hardened. And they wanted us to know what will happen if we come again. Another wave of unease rippled through the council. The Empire had built its power on one belief, that the strong ruled over the weak. But now, something stronger had appeared, something that had chosen to let them live. Not out of mercy, out of certainty. They believe they can destroy us, the Emperor said quietly. Torvik met his gaze. They don't believe it, Your Majesty. His voice was barely a whisper. They know it. The Emperor turned, walking to the massive war map that hovered in the center of the room. He stared at the glowing image of Earth, that small, insignificant planet that had now shaken the entire empire. For centuries, the Varnak had never considered humanity a threat. Now, they could think of nothing else. What would you have me do, Admiral? The Emperor asked. His voice was calm, but Torvik could feel the weight behind it. Torvik hesitated. He had expected anger, punishment, perhaps even execution. But instead, the Emperor was asking him for a solution. The Admiral swallowed. We cannot attack them again, he said. Not yet. Not until we understand them. We must learn how they think, how they fight. His claws tightened. We must understand why they are so different. General Krovak sneered. You want to study them, like frightened scholars. Torvik did not flinch. I want to understand the enemy before we make the mistake of underestimating them again. The Emperor stared at the war map. His fingers tapped against the edge of the console, deep in thought. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then, finally, he nodded. Send spies to their worlds, he ordered. Gather intelligence. Watch their fleets. Learn everything there is to know about these humans. His eyes darkened. And find their weakness. Torvik bowed. Yes, Your Majesty. The Emperor turned back to the council. His golden armor gleamed under the dim lights, his expression unreadable. Dismissed. The war generals rose, some reluctantly, others still seething with frustration. Torvik stepped back, his mind already focused on the mission ahead. He had survived battle with the humans, but survival was not victory. The next war would not be fought with fleets. It would be fought in the shadows. And this time, the Varnak would be the ones watching. He would take a fleet of Varnak warships, a small but elite force, and launch a surprise attack on Earth's most heavily fortified planet, Solarius. Solarius was Earth's primary military base, a world that housed their best technologies and elite forces. If the Varnak could take it, the humans would have no choice but to surrender. It was the perfect plan. But there was a catch. Torvik couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the humans were already aware of the Varnak plan. They had seen the way the Empire moved, the way they calculated every step. And the humans, they were always one step ahead. Torvik had to act quickly. He couldn't wait for the humans to make their next move. The Empire couldn't afford to hesitate. The fleet assembled at the edge of Varnock space, its ships brimming with energy and power. There was no turning back now. Torvik's heart raced in his chest as he gave the order. The engines of the fleet roared to life, and the ships blasted into hyperspace, hurtling toward Solarius. The journey was short, but it felt like an eternity. As they approached the planet, Torvik could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This could be the end for the Varnock Empire. If they failed, they would never recover. But if they succeeded, they would crush humanity and prove that the Varnock were still the supreme power in the galaxy. The Varnock fleet arrived in the shadow of Solarius, its military presence immediately detected by the planet's defenses. Torvik had expected this. The humans were not stupid. They had seen the fleet coming. But what the humans didn't know was that the Varnock had a surprise in store for them. The fleet's warships dropped out of hyperspace, their weapons primed, ready for battle. Torvik's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the massive firepower of the Varnock ships activate. The humans were already mobilizing, their own ships rising from the surface of Solarius to intercept them. The battle was swift, brutal, and unforgiving. Explosions rocked the sky as the two fleets clashed, the sound of weapons fire filling the air. Torvik gave the order for the fleet's most powerful ships to move toward Solarius' central command center, where the humans were preparing to launch their counterattack. But then something unexpected happened. A warning flashed across Torvik's console. Incoming. Human warship detected. Torvik's eyes widened. The humans had a new ship, one that he had never seen before. It was unlike anything in the Varnock fleet. Sleek, fast, and heavily armed, the ship moved with an unnatural grace, darting between the Varnock warships and firing with pinpoint precision. Torvik's mind raced. The humans had been preparing for this attack. They had known. They had expected the Varnock to come for Solarius, and now they were ready. The Varnock fleet was being torn apart, ship after ship being destroyed as the new human warship cut through their ranks. Torvik watched in disbelief as the Varnock's most advanced warships fell one by one. The humans were not fighting to survive this time. They were fighting to win. The Varnock had underestimated them again. They had thought they could defeat the humans with a quick, decisive strike. But the humans had anticipated everything. They had planned for this. They were ready. Torvik felt a cold chill run down his spine as he realized the truth. The humans were no longer the weak species that the Varnock had once believed them to be. They were a force of nature, something far greater than anything the Empire had ever faced. And the Varnock. The Varnock had no idea how to stop them. As the Varnock fleet struggled to maintain control, Torvik knew there was only one option left. They had to retreat. They had to save what was left of their fleet before it was completely destroyed. He gave the order. Fall back. All ships, retreat. The remaining Varnock warships turned and fled, their engines burning as they raced away from the battlefield. Torvik's heart sank as he watched the human warship chase them, relentless in its pursuit. The battle had been lost. The Varnock Empire, once the most powerful force in the galaxy, had been humbled. The humans had not only survived, they had triumphed. Torvik could only watch in silence as the last of the Varnock fleet disappeared into the darkness of space, defeated by an enemy that was no longer just a threat. They were a new force, a force that would reshape the galaxy forever.